We are back, and we are joined now by César García Hernández, Gregory H. Williams Chair of Civil Rights in Civil Rights and Civil Liberties at the Ohio State University Moritz College of Law, immigration lawyer, author of Welcome the Wretched in Defense of the Criminal Alien. César, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
It's my pleasure to be here, Emma.
So, you've talked about this, and I never thought of it this way. The idea that migrants in the United States are either portrayed as criminals. I mean, I've thought about that part, right, by the Republicans and by reactionaries, and honestly, some Democrats too, but also then as victims, right, by other members of our political class. And your book seeks to portray them as people. Why did you choose to kind of take that perspective?
Well, the book Welcome the Wretched seeks to portray migrants as the whole people that they are. They are always people, no matter
Right.
how often politicians like to dehumanize or to simplify their lives. They're full of complexities. They're full of contradictions, and in that sense, they're exactly the same as U.S. citizens. And that's the point of the book. It doesn't matter that our flaws and our imperfections are not a result of what country we are born in or where it is that we identify ourselves as citizens of, but in fact, but instead are a result of the fact that all of us will inevitably mess up, even though most of us spend most of our days trying to do right by the people around us and trying to rise to our better versions of ourselves.
Right. And I mean, this kind of trope about criminals, migrants as criminals, right? It's replaced more old school racism that, maybe would have come in the form of slurs back in the day when, say, Italians or Jewish people were discriminated against by our immigration system. Now it's just, oh, they're bringing crime. Can you talk a bit about that transition from those identifiable racist tropes to now this one that we're living through at this moment?
Yeah, there was a very a sizable shift that happened in the starting in the middle of the 1980s when the Reagan administration started to develop and trying to sell to the nation a war on drugs specifically on and as part of that political goal and as part of the push to get law enforcement officials behind the Reagan administration's decision to target illicit drug activity, we started to talk about migrants as being the source of those problems that the Reagan administration was locating in big cities around the United States. Those drugs had to come from somewhere. It was the idea, and they were coming from places in South America and the Caribbean. They were being brought to the United States by migrants, it's by people whose principal goal, if not their only reason for coming to the United States, was to engage in illegal activity, in criminal activity. In that sense, it's not all that different from some of the rhetoric that we hear from politicians today. But it did catch on in the 1980s with Republicans, and then in the 1990s under the Clinton administration, when and among fairly influential members of the Democratic Party in Congress, including folks like then Senator Joe Biden,
Mm.
who of course now occupies the White House.
And echoes that very similar rhetoric. I mean, even Obama's approach when trying to tackle immigration as president was about basically his deportations targeting criminals and not law-abiding people. What's what's your assessment of Obama's role in this kind of just swell of treating migration as a criminal problem?
President Obama famously announced in 2014 that his administration was going to revamp immigration policy, and it was going to be it was targeting, as he put it, felons, not families. He went on to say, we're going to go after gang members, not the mother who's trying to get her kids to school. As if, of course, felons are not parts of families, and families do not include felons, right? As if people exist in these binaries. You're either good or you're bad. You're fit for life in the United States because you avoid crime. But if you engage in criminal activity, then you have no right to remain in this country. When of course we don't have to look far beyond our families and friend networks. The latest news stories to know that our country is full of people whose activities run the gamut, from the best versions of themselves to the worst versions of themselves. And I think the President Obama has been true of Democratic administrations, presidential administrations, going back to the 1990s, is very much wrapped themselves in the idea that one run-in with the criminal legal system is one too many, and that in the political triangulation of immigration politics, it makes sense to sell the targeting of migrants who have criminal activity on their records as being the chip that is going to woo voters or woo Republicans to the negotiation table. And at least when it comes to Republicans in Washington, we've seen time and time again that no matter how much Democrats are willing to move in their direction, Republicans are pretty steadfast in their unwillingness to go along with them.
Well, to me, it's this kind of weaponization of the law or the legal system as a disciplinary tool for people who employ undocumented folks, right? Where it's essentially like you can use this looming threat of deportation in order to keep your workers quiet in some instances. And we know that Republicans represent capitalists, bosses, people who you enjoy having that point of leverage, honestly, on some employees.
Yeah, but I think this is something that we have to remember. Democrats are also supportive
Yes.
of the very law that created the federal government's power to decide who gets to work in the United States and who doesn't. That comes to us from 1986 when Reagan was president. It was a product of an important political compromise in which Republicans got those employer sanctions. But Democrats got a pretty wide-reaching amnesty component to that law. And these days, there's some wiggle room in that law that Democratic or that activists are trying to push Democratic-led states and cities to tap, because that law explicitly says that it applies to private employers and it applies to federal government agencies, barring those two from hiring people who don't have the federal government's permission to work in the United States. But it says nothing about whether it applies to states and local governments. And folks in California are trying to push the UC system. Folks in Denver are trying to push the city to hire migrants who have no work authorization from the United States as a way of helping those communities bring into the fold and into the labor market some of the folks who have arrived in recent months, courtesy of this busing program that Greg Abbott in Texas has been leading for many months now.
You wrote about how in the 1970s Congress passed a law restoring Robert E. Lee's full citizenship. And that is a contrast to basically saying we don't want criminals in this country to be citizens. Can you just talk to our audience about that contrast a bit?
Yeah, when Congress realized that Robert E. Lee had never been fully pardoned after leading the military insurrection that tried to destroy literally the United States of America. In the 1970s, Congress says, "Well, we can do something about it. We can restore his U.S. citizenship."
Posthumously.
And they absolutely can. Legally, they have every power to do that. But on the House floor, one member of Congress from Virginia, a guy named Caldwell Butler, says, "Well, if Robert E. Lee is not fit for U.S. citizenship, then who is?" Like that was apparently a serious question that he was at. Well, everyone who's claim to fame isn't trying to destroy the United States in the most literal sense, right? Whose life accomplishments don't involve a war that leads to the death of 750,000 people. Right? And so, Welcome to Wretched is I'm making the point that, look, if people go about their lives in very ordinary ways, unremarkable ways most of the time, and most of that, we stay out of trouble, and we mind our own business, and we try to go to work and live with our families to the best of our abilities. But inevitably, we all mess up. Inevitably, we all fail. And sometimes the folks who we hurt most poignantly are the folks who are closest to us, the people who we're most intimate with. And sometimes those failures actually rise to the level of being criminal activities. And yet, the United States of America is a country that is nothing if not full of deviants and misfits from day one to the to this very day. Right? And that's part of what enlivens our culture. Right? That's part of what makes our economy so robust, what makes our communities so vibrant, and part of the source of strength in our past, and I very much hope so into the future as well. And so we ought not to be pretending that to be a U.S. citizen means to be free from those imperfections, free from those flaws, when any one of us can look around, and we don't have to see who's on trial in New York, right, to know that there are U.S. citizens all over this country whose failures, may need to be remedied, but that doesn't mean that we have to cast them off as if our country is too frail to welcome folks whose imperfections stem from their very humanity, rather than from whatever country it is that they were born in.
Right, and you use this phrase in your book, how I think it seemed a little tongue in cheek, right? That we turn to the cold neutrality of crime, basically to justify keeping certain people out of this country. Can you talk about how we should reimagine crime and denaturalize it a bit? Because these are a series of choices that we make as a government and as a society that don't come from God. We've made these decisions to structure our immigration policy in particular in this way. And when you trace it back, it really is just an extension of racist exclusionary politics from before. Just now people think that they have a legal justification for their preconceived notions.
Whether you have a faith tradition or not, whatever your faith tradition is, we can all agree that we did not find the United States Code, the Federal Penal Code, or the state penal codes on a mountaintop someplace. We just created those, and we created those out of that messy cauldron of that is the political process. The war on drugs was very much spurred by the Reagan administration's desire to woo Southern white people into its fold, into the Republican Party's fold. And when we look at immigration specifically, the crimes that these days, year after year, constitute among the most heavily prosecuted crimes in the U.S. In the federal district court system nationwide are crimes called illegal entry and illegal reentry. They're basically two crimes that target folks who come into the United States without the federal government's permission. They were prosecuted under Obama, under Trump, under Biden, and these crimes were born in the 1920s out of that really blatantly racist period in which members of Congress openly targeted first Southern and Eastern Europeans in 1921 and 1924, and then they turned their attention to targeting Mexicans. And the idea was that these weren't folks who were racially categorized as not white in that moment of time, and who were thought by leading members of Congress to be unfit for life in the United States. And these two crimes that were enacted in 1929, they're still on the books today, and they're not some afterthought criminal offense. They are being prosecuted every single day in federal courthouses around the United States, and as a result, people are being criminalized formally through the federal court system for coming into the United States without the federal government's permission. And after that happens, of course, there's the possibility of punishment and then deportation after that.
And the idea of crossing the border as a criminal act. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of how that got criminalized, and maybe just to give us that context so we can reimagine it going forward?
In the 1920s, there was a strong anti-immigrant contingent within Congress that was successful in enacting quotas that really limited how many folks could come into the United States from anywhere outside of Northern and Western Europe. It really had already successfully cut off most migration from Asia, and then really targeted in the 20s folks from places like Italy and Eastern Europe.
And we should also say that the U.S. was turning boats away, not too long after that,
right.
to Jews who were fleeing the Nazis. Keep going.
And that the legal power that the federal government used during the Nazi rise to power and during World War II to block Jewish refugees who got as close to Miami as being able to see the lights on the shore was the power that was granted to them by these quotas that were enacted in 1921 and 1924. But neither of those was able to target Mexicans, and they weren't able to target Mexicans not because members of Congress who were rabidly racist against Italians, for example, or against Jews, for example, liked Mexicans. It was simply because they didn't have the votes. They didn't have the votes because agricultural interests along the Southwest and the West were simply too strong to allow repeated attempts to target Mexicans to Mexican migration into law. But that changed in the late 1920s when a guy from South Carolina named Coleman Livingston Blease, who was a white supremacist. This was a politician who's made his name by celebrating lynching. When he was governor of South Carolina, he was so vocally supportive of lynching, that other governors from the South actually asked him to tone it down because he was giving them a bad name. And yet he used that open white supremacist ideology to eventually land in the U.S. Senate, and there he teams up with some of these folks who had already learned how to enact restrictive immigration legislation, and they're finally able to gather the votes necessary to 1929 enact a bill that introduces into law for the very first time, or creates in federal law for the very first time, the crimes of entering the United States without the federal government's permission, and that specifically is supposed to be targeting Mexicans, and Mexicans today, almost a century later, who are the principal targets of those laws, and then beyond that, some other folks from other parts of Latin America.
And then how did criminalization of cannabis, deemed the scarier and more Mexican-sounding marijuana at this time, play into this as well?
This was all part of this anti-Mexican hysteria. Right? The idea was that Mexicans were debased, culturally inferior, inherently, innately lazy, and very, very, very much tying them to the similar depictions of enslaved individuals just a generation or so before then. Right? And so the decision to target cannabis, marijuana in particular, was very much tied up with this this inferiority, the depiction of Mexicans as inferior, and as a result, should be punished through whatever means were available, whether that was the criminal legal system for that could tap their use of marijuana, or it was the federal criminal courts that could tap the fact that they had entered the United States without the government's permission. But of course, what we all know is that those powers were turned off and on based on commercial interests, based on business interests. So when growers wanted cheap labor to pick their crops, the Border Patrol simply turned the other way. Sometimes they actually participated in helping Mexicans get across the border and get directly to the places where their labor was needed. But once those laws were in effect, then whenever they wanted to turn them on and get rid of Mexicans, specifically in the early years of the Depression, they could do so. When the time we needed more labor when the World War II started, of course, the U.S. turns to the Mexican government and says, hey, how about we partner? How about we team up and have some Mexicans come into the United States as temporary workers, because so many of our young people, our working age residents, are heading off to Europe and to Asia to go fight.
Well, really fascinating stuff. The book is called Welcome the Wretched, in Defense of the Criminal Alien, in quotes. César, thanks so much for coming on the show today. We'll put a link to your book wherever people are listening to or watching this and at majority.fm.
My pleasure.